Gentlemen, as you already know, we are at war. I quote the President of the United States. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The attack has effectively eliminated our entire battleship force for the time being. As a consolation, it has failed to catch any of our aircraft carriers in port, while the submarines and fuel reserves have escaped unharmed. During the past years, the Japanese military was engaged in a seemingly endless war against China, badly needing oil and other raw materials. Since we halted the trade with Japan, they schemed to seize the oil and mineral-rich East Indies and Southeast Asia. A Japanese attack into the Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines was expected, and plans prepared for it. But obviously, we have not prepared enough for an attack of this magnitude. The attack against Malaya has materialized yesterday, and last night the Japanese forces also attacked Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, and Wake Island. This morning, the Japanese continued with an attack on Midway. The Japanese offensive is extending throughout the Pacific, with a submarine force left mostly to itself. We need to act accordingly. For the time being, we will conduct operations as follows. Boats based in Pearl Harbor will patrol in Japanese home waters and also reconnoiter the Marshall Islands, as it's presumed that Japanese forces are massing in that archipelago for a second attack on our bases. Manila-based boats will deploy to guard the vital island of Luzon against approach by enemy forces. Individual patrol orders will be received from your commander. Welcome back, while we still hold a base here, that is. It seems that the Japanese don't waste any time. They've taken Hong Kong, landed on the Thai coast and also on Malaya, where they've pushed the British south towards Singapore. Our allies deployed their battleship force to counter the landings, but it was promptly sunk by Jap bombers based in Indochina. Thus, the Japs have gained control of all air and sea lanes in the South China Sea. Obviously, the next target will be Singapore, and there's little hope to hold them back from taking the city. The Philippines were attacked with multiple landings on the north and south parts of Luzon, forcing the mixed U.S. local defenses to abandon Manila, including our submarine base there, and retreat into the Bataan Peninsula. For the moment, our troops are holding back the Japanese, but we don't know for how long they can continue and what the supply situation is. It has been suggested that submarines be used to supply the troops and evacuate key personnel from the region, so please make all preparations pending your orders. The last few months were not good at all for us in the Pacific Theater, as the Japanese invasions progressed at a rapid pace. In Burma, despite the opposition from Allied troops, the Japanese kept advancing and pushing the front line forward, forcing Allied troops to retreat to India by mid-April. In the south, after 6 days of heavy bombing, the Japanese landed and captured the island of Timor on February 22nd. They also got their foot into the Celebes, Sumatra, Bali, and Borneo, gaining air control over the Java Sea and nearby straits. With these elements in place, they were ready for their next target, Java. In an attempt to delay the invasion, an Allied fleet of heavy and light cruisers plus destroyers sailed to intercept the Japanese. For 2 long days, our guys fought with the Japs, but due to inferior numbers and inferior firepower, we'd lost. A lot of good men perished back there, as only 4 of the original 10 destroyers escaped. With the Allied fleet defeated, there was nothing else to stop the invasion. So from March 7th, Java is under complete Japanese control. Our submarine command, that was temporarily located there, has retreated to the port, Fremantle in Australia. We've got it. Our intel guys have broken the Japanese communications code, and we finally have the chance to do something real about it. A Japanese amphibious assault is on its way towards Port Moresby. The fall of Port Moresby and the rest of New Guinea would provide the Japs with a platform ideally placed for an offensive towards New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, which would cut our supply lines between Hawaii, Panama, and Australia. It would also strengthen the line of defense for their newly acquired oil source. Since we stopped them to the north on the mountain line, Japan's only choice is to approach through Coral Sea for the attack. Our intelligence predicts that invasion forces would be escorted by at least 2 fleet carriers. To counter their intentions, we have ordered the only 2 battle-ready carriers we have at the moment to take position off the New Hebrides. With help from land-based air power, we might match the Japanese attack and turn the tables on them. To support this operation, our submarines will patrol the area between New Britain and Bougainville. They will provide advanced scouting to the US task force and may get to take a shot at a Japanese flat top. Gentlemen, we finally have some good news. Our intelligence proved correct, and the enemy launched an attack with the aim of capturing Port Moresby. Their invasion force cut south through Jomard Passage, with a pair of aircraft carriers providing cover against any US ships encountered. As a counter to their movements, Task Forces 11 and 17, each centered around one aircraft carrier, were deployed to the area. On the 3rd of May, the Japs landed on Tulagi, with planes from one of our carriers promptly hitting that group with minor results on the following day. The next day, Port Moresby was hit by Japanese bombers, but then our boys and the Japs searched the seas in vain, passing next to each other, but without achieving contact. On the 7th of May, the search finally achieved results, with our planes sinking a light carrier and the Japs getting a fleet oil tanker for their effort. The next day, the big flat tops came under fire, in the first ever carrier-to-carrier battle. We lost one of ours and the other one was damaged, but our flyboys hit them hard too, and we're pretty sure that their carrier division is not going to be doing battle anytime soon. In the end, the Japanese were forced to retreat, and we've thus put a halt to their expansion to the south. It's time to turn the tables onto them, and intel says we might soon get our chance. It seems that the Japanese are preparing to launch a massive offensive against the atoll of Midway and against the Aleutian Islands. It seems that this offensive is in fact a trap to finish off our Pacific Fleet, which would guarantee the Japanese naval supremacy over the Pacific. We anticipate that the Japanese force will be composed of 4 carriers. Against them, we will need every available US flight deck. Fortunately for us, the biggest Japanese aircraft carriers will not be available for this battle, still being under repairs as a result of their participation in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Our task force from the Southwest Pacific area was called back to Pearl Harbor to provision and resortie. One aircraft carrier severely damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea is under repairs, with the hope of being available in a couple of days. Our naval forces will assemble northeast of the atoll. Our submarines must patrol west of Midway and southwest of Aleutian Islands. Any enemy target sighted should be reported and engaged. The most decisive naval battle in US history took place at Midway. We had surprise on our side and even some luck. On June 4th, our search planes discovered the Japanese fleet northeast of Midway. An air battle quickly developed. The turning point came at mid-morning, when the Japanese fighters were drawn down to sea level by attacking the US torpedo bombers launched from Midway, the vast majority of which were destroyed. Their great sacrifice cleared the skies above for the next waves of American dive bombers sent from our aircraft carriers. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The 4th Japanese carrier retaliated with 2 air attacks. The most vulnerable US carrier, the one just patched at Pearl Harbor, absorbed both attacks, suffering heavy damage. Unfortunately, it was sunk later during salvage efforts by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine. American scout aircraft subsequently located the last Japanese carrier later in the afternoon. Our carriers launched a final strike of dive bombers, and soon it was sunk. The Japanese fleet retreated. We won. We have scored a clear victory against the Japanese fleet, losing 1 carrier and 1 destroyer, while the Japanese have lost 4 carriers. Besides that, we've managed to capture a Japanese Zero, which can help us to understand the technology behind it and use this knowledge against the Japanese. This huge victory could even represent a turning point in the Pacific War. An overall look in the Pacific area during the last period shows that the Japanese are rapidly consolidating their gains in the South Pacific, building naval port facilities, leveling land for airfields, fortifying jungle hill masses to hold the islands they have taken, and to support subsequent operations on the march to Australia. Large bases were built in the Palus, in the Carolines and at Rabaul and the Bismarcks. Smaller bases hold the Marshalls and the Gilberts, in addition to New Britain and New Ireland and the Bismarcks, and Buka, Bougainville, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Because of the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway, where we seriously damaged the Japanese fleet, a naval balance of forces is created, and this allows us to think of an amphibious assault in the South Pacific. Of all enemy strongpoints, that on Guadalcanal appears most threatening because it lays closest to Australia and to the South Pacific ferry route. Besides that, the Japanese are building an airport there. It's obvious that whoever holds that airfield will dominate the whole area. So if we're going to blunt the Japanese advance into the South Pacific, Guadalcanal would have to be the place. Our submarines have the mission to support the amphibious force and to cripple the Japanese transport service in the area, which will be the key to our success. Back in August, a very powerful amphibious U.S. attack force was sent to take over Guadalcanal airfield and the surrounding occupied islands. After 2 days, the Guadalcanal airfield, named by the U.S. Marines Henderson Field, was under our control. During that month, the Japanese made 2 attempts to take over Henderson Field, but they failed, being stopped by the U.S. Marines. In the following period, the Japanese made an attempt to land more troops, but they were blocked by our carrier force in a naval battle in the Eastern Solomons, where the Japanese lost a carrier and a destroyer for no U.S. losses. The next month, in September, another 2 attacks were stopped by the U.S. Marines, with the help of 4,000 Marine reinforcements, which had landed despite the opposition of the Japanese Navy, which did manage to sink 1 carrier and 1 destroyer from the U.S. convoy. During October, both sides brought in reinforcements, and in the process 2 naval battles were fought, one off Cape Esperance and one off Santa Cruz Islands. Later, another 2 Japanese attempts of taking the Henderson Field took place, and again, they failed. Last month, another 2-day naval battle took place in the Slot between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy, who were trying to resupply their troops in Guadalcanal. This battle resulted in many casualties, and many ships damaged or sunk for both sides, our greatest trophy being 1 Japanese battle cruiser sunk. As an overall result, the U.S. Navy succeeded in stopping the enemy and delivering the supplies and the reinforcements to Guadalcanal. This should facilitate our U.S. Marines' mission in taking over the entire island and gaining air control in the Solomons. With Guadalcanal Island under our control, providing air cover from Henderson Field, we must keep pushing further to gain full control of the Solomons. The islands from New Georgia are our next objective, and then up north, Bougainville. As we speak, our amphibious force is heading towards Rendover Island, our first target. Our submarine force must support the naval forces and must cover the up northern sectors, cutting the Japanese supply lines and reinforcement transports towards the Solomon Islands. Our main interests are the traffic lanes coming southeast of Paolo, south from Truk, southwest from the Marshalls and Gilberts. This way, we'll cut off the Japanese supplies towards our area of interest. During the past months, we've made good progress in the Solomons, despite the desperate Japanese resistance and attempts of repelling our forces. Until August, different attempts were made by the Japanese to bring reinforcements to New Georgia, and several small naval battles were fought in Kula Gulf and in Vella Gulf, with the U.S. Navy managing to push them back. With us controlling the sea, the Japanese had to stop sending reinforcements to New Georgia, which made our advance easier. So by the end of August, fighting on the island was over. During September, the advance of the Allied troops through Colombagara and Vella Lavala Islands intending to push the enemy to the north was progressing quite steadily. By the end of the month, the Japanese started evacuating both islands. In the beginning of October, Solomon Islands were completely under our control. The second route to the Philippines and Japan goes through the Central Pacific, west through the Marianas, passing through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands on the way. On the 20th of November, we will land in the Gilberts, more precisely on Betio. We estimate that the enemy reaction will include naval sorties from Truk. They might also choose a northerly route to avoid detection, and probably they will refuel en route. Our submarines will patrol around Truk to detect enemy sorties, and also the routes between Truk and Marshalls, engaging any opportunity target. With the Gilberts taken, our next objective in the Central Pacific area is the Marshalls Archipelago. The offensive started with our land-based bombers, hitting Kwajalein and Waje atolls. The 5th Carrier Fleet is moving from Hawaii towards Marshall Islands, while Task Force 58, located southeast of the Marshalls, is already pounding Japanese airfields to pieces. Once the Marshalls are taken, the next objective will be the Carolines. The big plan is to shatter the Japanese resistance in the entire Central Pacific area as fast as possible, to be able to move further north towards Japanese homeland. Submarine patrols will be increased in order to cripple Japanese supply lines and troop transports in Central Pacific. Any success against enemy shipping will affect the enemy garrisons in the Marshall and Caroline Islands, and thus support the respective invasions of those islands. With any Weetalk in our hands, Truk badly damaged and the Carolines being untenable, the next objective are the Mariana Islands. Further down the road, we will use them as a pad for operations against the Philippines and Japan. A major attack there will pressure the Japanese to sortie with major units of their fleet, seeking a decisive confrontation with the US Navy. If that is the case, the Japanese carrier fleet will be our primary concern. Task Force 58 will support the invasion of the Marianas by shelling defenses and providing air support in preparation of the landings. The first target for the Grunts will be Saipan Island. While our surface forces begin the assault on Mariana Islands, the submarine force will cover the west approaches to report the eventual sortie of the Japanese fleet and then engage it. As we expected, the Japanese concentrated 2 fleets west of the Philippines in order to engage the US invading force. Prepared for the encounter with the Imperial Japanese fleet, Task Force 58 moved west of Saipan. Again, the fleets themselves never met each other, the battle being fought by carrier-based aircraft. Fortunately, the air offensive launched by the Japanese cost them most of their planes. The superior training of US aircrew was apparent, as besides shooting down hundreds of enemy planes, they managed to sink 1 carrier and inflict damage to 3 others. Our submarines took their share in this action, sinking 2 other carriers. The Japanese fleet was basically crushed and forced to retreat. To complete the victory, our ground forces soon took control of Saipan. The invasion of the Marianas Islands was a total success. The next step in the American strategy is for the 2 roads to merge in the Philippines. Liberating them will both cut an important supply of rubber and also threaten the oil supply routes running from the Dutch East Indies to the Japanese mainland. The liberation will begin with landings by the US 6th Army on the island of Leyte. Next, we will split north into Luzon and south into Mindanao, thus fulfilling MacArthur's promise for return to the Philippines. Given the grave consequences that would befall the Empire should our plan work out, we expect the Japanese to react in force. They are weakened, but not beaten, and their battleship force may win the day if properly deployed. From bases in Brunei and mainland Japan, sneaking through passages such as Surigao Strait, or even engaging in open water, the Japanese Navy will be looking for a decisive battle. To counter such a possibility, the 3rd US Fleet will deploy to the north of the landing forces. Comprising our most modern battleships and the greatest aircraft carrier group ever assembled, it can block and then smash any southward thrust. Additionally, the 7th US Fleet is supporting the landings with old battleships, the Pearl Harbor Force, and escort carriers, ready to protect the southern flank if required. We may be looking at the greatest naval engagement in the history of warfare. The submarine force will support this operation through advanced scouting. Ships based in Australia will be deploying on a line between Borneo and northern Luzon, while Hawaii boats will be patrolling between Japan and the Philippines. It is of utmost importance that any enemy surface force encountered be reported and then engaged with extreme prejudice. If any of us were hoping for a large sea battle, they sure got it. The Japanese, always looking for the decisive battle to turn the fate of the war in the Pacific, have come out in force. The main Japanese force, comprising their most powerful and modern battleships, was meant to sneak through the St. Bernardino Strait and attack from the north our landing forces in the Gulf of Leyte. In a classic pincher maneuver, a 2nd battleship force would engage our forces from the south, passing through the Surigao Strait. To cover up their approach, a decoy force of aircraft carriers and hybrid battleships would come from the north. It was hoped that the powerful US fleet guarding the northern approach would pursue them and leave the way open for the Japanese battleships. In fact, their plan worked for the most part. After submarine and air attacks left the Central Force seemingly annihilated, the US 3rd Fleet headed for the northern force. It did sink the 4 Japanese carriers in that fleet the next day, but the real danger had passed unnoticed in the south. The 2 pinchers had arrived in position. While the southern one was smashed during the night through a classical torpedo and gun action, the Central Force appeared almost intact near the American landing beaches. There was little that could be done for the moment, but luck was with us. Faced with aggressive attacks by destroyers and aircraft that were taking off almost unarmed, and lacking accurate intelligence on what they were actually facing, the Japanese retreated after sinking only a couple of escort carriers. We are making preparations for the final attack on Japanese homeland. Between the Mariana Islands and Japan is the Iwo Jima Island, which we need to secure before moving forward. The airfields on this island will be the launching pad for our future air attacks against Japan. Supporting the invasion force, the submarine force must patrol in the northwest area of Iwo Jima in order to detect and report any interference from the Japanese Navy. As well, they must cover the oil shipping line between Japan and Singapore, west of Iwo Jima, to shatter the mainline convoy system beyond all hope of repair. Iwo Jima is captured, but we paid a huge price for it. It took 72 days of air bombardment, a 3-day naval hammering, and 36 days of desperate ground fighting to defeat the Japanese garrison of 23,000 men. Almost 7,000 U.S. Marines died in this action, probably marking the bloodiest months fighting in the history of the U.S. Marines. After these events, we are wondering how long it would take to capture Japan itself. Our next target will be Okinawa, an island that lies only 325 miles south of Japan. A U.S. force, counting 1,457 ships and 183,000 soldiers, is heading that way. The submarine force will be dispatched around Honshu and Kyushu to observe any attempts of interference from Japan. The landing on Okinawa was a pleasant surprise for us because we encountered little opposition, and by the end of the day, 50,000 men were put ashore. However, we suffered several important losses before the landing because of the Japanese aircrafts launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. By the end of the operation, almost 1,900 suicide attacks were launched against U.S. forces, sinking 25 ships and damaging 254. Another spectacular suicide attempt was made by the giant battleship Yamato, which was detected in the inland sea by our submarines. The next day, U.S. planes from the carrier fleet attacked the battleship. After being hit by 10 torpedoes and 5 bombs, Yamato blew up and sunk. As expected, the occupation of the island was extremely difficult, taking 80 days of unceasing conflict and huge losses for us to defeat the Japanese troops, which counted around 110,000 men. Again, as after Iwo Jima, we are asking ourselves how many casualties would have to be suffered for the occupation of all of Japan. The war has ended. Its mighty fleet now resting on the bottom of the ocean, its industry in ruins, and its cities burning. Japan has finally accepted surrender. How did we get to this? The Empire of Japan had long been expanding in Asia, looking to acquire resources for its growing industry. In 1931, it conquered Manchuria. Later, in 1937, Japanese troops invaded a China already fragmented by corruption and civil war. Looking to further expand to the south and acquire vital oil sources in Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, Japan needed to tackle the prime contender in the region, the United States. Thus, a bold plan was conceived to eliminate the U.S. fleet in one strike, which landed in Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. While devastating in effect, the raid failed to take out several important targets: the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Fleet Oil Reserve, and the submarine base. This would prove to be their undoing, as it is precisely the submarine force that strangled the Empire. Our submarines started the war with good submarine designs, but an outdated doctrine, troublesome torpedoes, and overcautious skippers. This led to many lost opportunities in the first stages of the war, while the Japanese juggernaut pushed to the Malay Barrier. As the war progressed, both our men and their commanders improved, and the submarines were sent into missions better suited to their capabilities. Key choke points in the Japanese supply lines were identified and attacked, with the Luzon Strait becoming a real graveyard of Marus. In 1944, with the technical and doctrine troubles of the force sorted out, the Japanese merchant marine was virtually destroyed, and complete blockade of the Japanese islands had been accomplished. The closing stages had the submarines practically out of targets. Even the heavily defended Sea of Japan had been penetrated by daring wolf packs. By now, the submarine war was over. The struggle has lasted 4 years and has cost us 3,500 men. But we owe these men the destruction of more than half of the Japanese shipping fleet sunk during the war, and perhaps even victory.